Back in my 20s, I was what you might call an adventure girl. About 10 years ago, give or take, something happened that changed that. I moved to the city, got a boring job and a boarding apartment, and became decidedly adverse to the outdoors. Haven't really told anyone about it in all that time, save my now wife because, well, for one, they'd think I'm crazy, and for two, I don't want to think about it. Finally putting it here though, because you all deserve to hear it. After all, you probably saved my life. At the time, I had just graduated college and moved from Texas to Alaska, out of a desire for, you guessed it, adventure. I had a job doing stuff I liked, paid well and gave me enough vacation days to get out and do something really adventurous every once in a while. One thing I'd had on my bucket list since moving north was driving the Dalton Highway. For the unfamiliar, that's a generously highway that goes from Fairbanks to Prudhoe Bay on the Arctic Ocean. It's a 500-mile, 11-hour drive in the summer. Thanks to work realities, I wasn't able to get out there until early autumn. By early autumn, the snow had started, but the plows were still able to keep the highway pretty clear, and I was driving a 95 Toyota Land Cruiser kitted out for expeditions. I fucking love that thing. Besides that, I was an adventure girl. I was prepared. I had camping gear, emergency gear, a satellite phone, plenty of food and water, enough jerry cans for the trip there and back, and Sam Colt's greatest invention in the center console, just in case. For the unfamiliar, that's the 1911. I fucking love that gun. I was planning to make the trip in 2 days, sleeping in the back of the Land Cruiser halfway. I had enough blankets to keep warm, and I had a nice comfy space back there that I could fit in. I'd have to drive slower because of the snow. I wanted to enjoy the scenery, and the sun was setting pretty early by that time of year. I had a good start that day and the driving was fine. By the time shit went down, it had been dark for about an hour, and I was getting into the foothills of the Brooks Range. That's good scenery and also terrain that I didn't want to be going through in the dark, so I was just about ready to pull over for the night when I saw caution flashers up ahead. For the unfamiliar, a hard rule for any Alaskan is that you always pull over when you see someone in distress on the side of a remote road like that, especially after the snow starts. If they aren't prepared for an emergency, there is a very good chance that you could save their life. So that's exactly what I did. I pulled over next to a Nissan SUV. Not as nicely kitted out as mine, but not bad either. I figured they were doing the same thing that I was. Small world. By the jack under one axle and the wheel sitting next to the car, they'd blown a tire. What I didn't see though were the people. I got out of my Land Cruiser, crunching down into the snow and looked around. There aren't a ton of trees that far north, but there are quite a few patches of evergreens that, while not quite forest, can be pretty dark and thick on a snowy night. "Hey," I called, my voice going dead a few yards away as sound does in snowy woods. "Y'all need help?" No answer. Dead silence, save the faint clicking over the flasher from inside their Nissan. I shouted again, "Anybody there? I've got tools." No answer. Dead silence. Considered myself a pretty brave bitch back then, but I'll admit that I was creeped out at this point. This vehicle definitely hadn't been here for that long, and there was no one to be seen. Besides that, the dead quiet and the darkness of the night were unnerving. It wasn't that weird for it to be silent on a snowy night like this. That far north, but still creepy. Creepy enough that I hopped back in the car and grabbed my .45, storing it in one of the big pockets in front of my jacket, just in case. There were bears up there. I approached the Nissan and saw footprints in the snow. Okay, not a ghost car. One pair had been crouched down at the removed tire, and the other had been standing a couple feet away, by the rear of the SUV. The latter pair had then at some point headed off toward the tree line, stopped a few yards down, paced around a bit, then continued into the woods. The pair near the tire and then, presumably later, gotten up and ran after the first. I was no tracker, but it's not hard to tell when someone's running in the snow. Now I was really creeped out. I was tempted to hop back in the car and keep driving for a good long while, but like I said, this could easily have been life or death up there. Besides, I had my 45. It could handle a grizzly. Probably. That was the worst I'd find up here. Probably. So off I went, following those 2 sets of footprints into the woods. It was fucking dark, but don't worry y'all, I had a really nice flashlight. Surefire, baby. Adventure girl, remember? The dead quiet seemed to get even deader and quieter as soon as I passed the tree line, as does in the snowy woods. Probably. The only thing comforting me that I hadn't gone deaf was the sound of my breath and my boots crunching in the snow. Hey, I called again. Maybe 20 yards into the woods. Is everyone okay? This time I got a response. It was a woman's voice, and it sounded afraid. Over here, it called. Help! I got a spring in my step at that, jogging towards the sound of the voice, shining my light through the trees to try and catch a glimpse. Over here, it called again, much closer. Help! Remember when I said y'all probably saved my life? This is when that happened. I stopped. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end and a chill ran down my spine. Something was off about that voice. Couldn't put my finger on it, but it was just slightly wrong. Pointed my light towards where I had heard it. Are you hurt? I said. Voice raised but not quite shouting anymore. Help! The voice called again, only it was even closer this time. I hadn't heard the crunch of any footsteps. Over here! My grip on my flashlight tightened and my heart started to hammer in my chest. This was not right. I'd read a lot of No Sleep back then and had watched and listened to my fair share of spooky stories. At the time, I didn't think any of this stuff was real, but what was happening to me felt way too familiar, and it was setting off alarm bells. Something about this exact situation was tugging at the back of my mind as something I should be terrified of. I tried one more time. What's your name? I asked cautiously. Help, the voice called, and it couldn't have been more than a few yards off. That was enough for me to swap my light to my left hand and bring out the Colt with my right. I pointed both in the direction of that voice and finally caught a glimpse of something besides trees. Off in the distance, barely visible, I could see a bundle of something laying in the snow. It was human-sized and the snow all around it was stained dark. My head was in the middle of processing what it was seeing when I saw a movement between me and the body. Oh shit, that was a body. I pointed my flashlight and gun at the source of the movement. It was humanoid with 2 arms and 2 legs, but it was all wrong. The limbs were too long and it was too tall. Its hair was thin and weary. It had antlers. Fucking antlers. And its face, which was also, I assure you, really wrong, was stained dark with what I can only assume was blood. I fired 2 shots and hauled ass. I don't know if the bullets slowed it down. I don't even know if I hit it. I ran faster than I'd ever run before, and by the cracking branches and crunching snow behind me, it was giving chase. My heart felt like it was going to explode out of my chest and my lungs burned from sucking in the frosty air. Once or twice I saw death flash before me as I nearly lost my footing in the snow, but I managed to stay upright. As I ran, I heard more snapping, more crunching, not just behind me now, but all around. There were more. I got really lucky that night. I was lucky to have spotted the body, lucky to have run just fast enough not to fall on my face. Lucky none of whatever they were, I have a guess but I'd rather not hazard it, were just a bit closer or faster. I was lucky that I had dabbled in enough spooky stories that my alarm bells had gone off, and I was lucky that the poor couple in that Nissan had gotten stranded there and suffered the grisly fate they suffered. After all, I was planning to stop just as I saw those caution flashers. I'd have been right there in those same woods, asleep. I don't want to think about what would have happened to me if that had been the case. I made it to my car, which again was lucky to have left running, thinking I wouldn't go far. I leapt in, slammed and locked the door, and threw it in reverse as I saw dark, lanky shapes coming out of the trees. As I got moving, the headlights revealed what had been chasing me. I can't say exactly how many it was, at least half a dozen. All of them were similarly stretched, pale to the point of being almost white, with various forms of antlers and primitive-looking clothing. I reversed down the road as fast as I dared, without risking going off and dooming myself to certain death, for a good half-mile before I finally got the nerve to turn around. Then I flew down the highway all the way back to the Fairbanks, only stopping once. I found a nice, well-lit hotel in the middle of the city. The next day I was back in Anchorage. I thought about calling the state troopers. Someone was going to find the Nissan, probably find the bodies. They'd find my casings, my tire tracks. I could end up a murder suspect. I decided against it though. If I ratted myself out, I'd be a murder suspect anyway. And then they'd know it was me. Better to bet that no one could tie me to that scene, especially being as far from local as I was. Over the next week I packed my shit, bailed on my job and my lease, and moved back to Texas. I never ended up with police banging on my door, so I guess I made the right choice. I still have nightmares about those wrong, elongated things chasing me. I probably have PTSD, but it's not like I can talk to a therapist about it without ending up in a loony bin. I'm not an adventure girl anymore. I never go anywhere at night, and I stay in the city as much as possible. I didn't get out of there unscathed, but I got out of there alive, which is better than can be said for the folks in the Nissan. I was lucky. There was a strange message in my fortune cookie last night. It was 3 a.m. I stumbled into my apartment, wasted, starving, carrying a bag of greasy takeout boxes filled with ginger beef, barbecue pork fried rice. I wolfed it down and then passed out. Typical Saturday night. Wake up the next morning with little memory of the night before, and the kitchen's a mess. Dirty plates in the sink, grains of rice scattered across the counter. Feel nauseous and head to the washroom and puke out everything in my stomach. Typical Sunday morning. Start cleaning up and notice a half-eaten fortune cookie sitting on the table with that thin strip of paper right beside it. Walk over, eat the other half of the cookie, and prepare to throw the paper out. But before I do that, I decide to give it a read, for shits and giggles, you know? The people in the basement remember you. I almost laughed at first, because it seemed like something that I would do. Some cheeky young hire at the fortune cookie company slipping in a few creepy messages as a joke. I could appreciate it. It was funny enough. Then I turned it around, and in place of the usual row of lucky numbers was what appeared to be an address. Now this was strange. First thing I thought was that maybe it was the address for the factory the cookie was produced in. That made sense, but did it really? If it was supposed to be an extension of the first joke, then it didn't quite track, but it could have also been an oversight, a mistake in the print. Whatever, I thought. I tossed the paper into the trash and got ready for the gym. My way of feeling like less of a piece of shit after a night of heavy drinking. Predictably, it wasn't the best workout, but that wasn't entirely due to the hangover. Couldn't seem to stop thinking about the address. It hadn't quite registered for the first time I'd read it, but as I thought about it on the treadmill, I was pretty sure that I knew it from somewhere. It was familiar. Finish the free weights, take a shower, and then sit in a coffee shop with a sandwich and an espresso, and I'm still thinking about where I'd seen it before. After getting home, I tried to resist the urge to fish the fortune out of the trash. I asked myself what the point was. Even if I did recognize it from somewhere, how was the effort worth it? In retrospect, that was more of a cope. The source of my apprehension had been deeper than that, though it was something I couldn't quite understand at the time. I felt nervous and I couldn't justify why, which only served to make me even more nervous. Eventually I caved and began digging through the trash. I held the paper up, looking at the address for a long time before a vague recognition slowly began to sink in. Then I sat down at the computer and searched it up on Google Maps, and as soon as the images loaded up, the memories began to flood in. The street I grew up on, the woods behind the cul-de-sac, the house that sat right across from ours. I stared at the screen until it started to not feel real. Then I rechecked the address 4 or 5 times, but there was no mistaking it. That was it. One of the houses I grew up next to. Immediately I tried to rationalize it. What if somebody who's associated with the company lives there? Maybe something got mixed up and his data ended up in a fortune cookie. No, I thought, that couldn't be right, because that house had burned down years ago. I tried to think back to the time, but found that my memories of it were strangely distant, hard to recall. I must have sat there for hours thinking, failing to recall of anything of note. All I knew for sure was that the vast majority of my childhood up to the beginning of high school, I lived right across from that house. And then something happened that caused it to burn down, and I moved away. I couldn't for the life of me remember what the event was, if anybody had died. Hell, I couldn't even remember who had lived there. We must have met at least a few times, I thought. But I came up with nothing. It wasn't even the case that I'd been too young, since I had memories from before we'd moved there. This just didn't sit right. For it to be a coincidence would be crazy. There was literally no chance. So then what was this? It was a paralyzing thing to have on your mind, and it turns into all you can think about, all you can focus on. Answers. I needed answers. Now there were a few options, the first being go back to the takeout place in order to ask questions. Problem was, I'd pretty much blacked out that night and had only the haziest recollection of even ordering. The other option was obvious enough. I had the address after all. It wasn't too far away, maybe a 45-minute drive out of the city. As far as safety, I couldn't imagine there being an issue. It was a suburban community, and it wasn't like I was planning on breaking into the place or anything. So I settled on it and made the drive over the next morning, and the house was exactly like I had thought. Completely burned down, a blackened shell of a place. I thought seeing it in person might cause the memories to flood back in, but that didn't happen. I sat there in my car for 10, maybe 15 minutes, and at no point did I ever see anybody else outside. So I decided to go in. I know that I said I wasn't planning to, but there was no way I was just going to leave it like that. There was no police tape, no signs telling me to stay out, and if there was anybody squatting, I'd just leave the way I came. So I walk into the house, and immediately my senses are assailed by dust and the smell of old, burnt wood. It's darker than I had expected. I use the flashlight on my phone to navigate, look around the living room. Then I remember the fortune, the supposed people in the basement. The hairs on the back of my neck stick up. I stop, listen carefully. Nothing but a light breeze outside, and this gives me enough confidence to approach the basement door. It's closed, and the area around it seems to have taken less damage than the rest of the place. It looked almost untouched. Reach out and grab the knob and push the door. A wall of gloom. Shine the light down and it becomes smothered after a first few steps. Stand there for a while, listening to nothing but my own breaths. And then I hear something else, something faint. Maybe a footstep, but I can't be sure of it. And then I hear it again, and then again as it gets closer. Definitely a footstep, probably a squatter, I think. It has to be. I want to call out and say something, but can't bring myself to do so. The air seems heavy and there's an electric feel to it. It's unnatural and I don't like it at all. I hear more footsteps and then it's joined by another pair, and then suddenly it sounds like a dozen feet are stomping in unison, all of them getting closer to the base of the stairs. I slam the door shut and run out of there. Afterwards, I was sitting in my car, breathing heavy, trying to reconcile what the hell had just happened. I looked over at the house, almost expecting something to burst out the front door, a horde of emaciated ghouls or something, but nothing came, so I calmed myself down and drove away. If I went looking for answers, I obviously didn't find any. After arriving back in the city, I pulled over by the side of the road. and took out my phone and looked through my search history, finding the bar that I'd gone out to that night. I drove over there and searched around the area, and sure enough, there was a small takeout place tucked into the far corner of a dingy strip mall. I stared at it, trying to see if I could rouse up some memories of what happened that night. Didn't work, but I was still sure that this was the right place. I got out of my car and walked in, practically storming up to the counter while the woman behind it stared at me with confusion on her face that was palpable even behind the forced smile. "What can I get for you, sir?" she asked. Suddenly I felt like the biggest idiot alive. What the hell was I supposed to say? What was I doing here? Then I remembered that I had the fortune in my pocket, so I took it out and held it up. I was just wondering about this fortune I got. You see, there's an address on it, and Stammering through the sentence, I watched as the woman's smile began to fade. Slowly at first until it morphed into a scowl, something malicious. But just as soon as it does, it's back to the smile, causing me to question whether or not I had really just seen that. "Just wait there a minute, sir," she says to me before disappearing into the kitchen. I look around. Nobody else in the restaurant but me. The place was blanketed by a creeping silence, the kind where you're just waiting for it to be broken. My eyes begin to wander and I look up at a big framed analog clock. Its hands aren't moving. Then I look down and pick up one of the paper menus sitting in a stack on the counter. Open it up and every single item is just the same line of gibberish copied over and over and over. I tense up, feeling I've just walked into some obscure trap. I put the menu down and prepare to leave, taking one last glance back to make sure that nobody's following me. And right before I'm about to turn around, I see it, a face staring at me through the kitchen window. It was pale and had a dead stare, and there was something off about it. Something not quite human, but I didn't look at it for long enough to figure it out. I backed out through the doors, and once in the parking lot, I turned and sprinted to my car. From there I sped back to my apartment, my heartbeat elevated dangerously high the entire drive. I started to get a bit paranoid. Maybe something had followed me. Maybe something was hiding inside my bathroom, thoughts like that. After a while I was able to calm down and I started to do some research on the restaurant. Nothing came up. No website, no telephone listing, nothing. Google Map view of the street only shows the store that had presumably existed before it. None of this shit is tracking, so I resort to looking for some answers from a source I wouldn't have gone to otherwise. My father. Now you need to understand that I have something of a strained relationship with the man. In other words, I haven't made contact with him in over a decade. I don't know where he lives or what he's done with his life, or if he's even alive. I guess a relative would have told me if he had died, but I can't even be sure of that. The strangest thing is, as I sit here thinking about it now, I can't even pin down why this would be the case, where my apparent resentment towards the man would be coming from. The memories I have of him are decent enough. I can't recall him ever beating or screaming at me, nothing like that. The more that I think about it, the more I get the feeling that it all has something to do with that house. But I still had his number, so I decided to give him a call, just to ask some questions. I was almost certain that he would have changed it by now, but he ended up answering. Of course, the call started out awkward. I was stumbling over my words, trying to find the right things to say, which was something that seemed next to impossible. Despite this, he sounded strangely calm about the whole thing, almost as if he'd been expecting the call. I went ahead and told him everything that happened. The fortune cookie, the house, the footsteps in the basement, all of it. I wasn't sure what kind of a response I was expecting. That he'd call me insane, maybe? Ask me what in the hell I was even talking about? Why, after all these years of zero communication, I'd be coming to him with some shit like this. But surprisingly, he seemed to be understanding about it. He seemed to be taking me seriously. He told me to calm down, that he had something he needed to tell me, something he should have divulged years ago. But he needed to do it in person. He told me that he was living in a town a few hours away, that he'd drive over and meet me at 3 p.m. tomorrow. I asked him where. His response? The house. The fucking house. I asked him why it had to be there, if we could meet anywhere else. For obvious reason, I had reservations about going back to that place. All he said was that I shouldn't worry and that he explained everything once we were there. The conversation certainly left a lot to be desired, but I've decided to go anyway. I'll sleep on it first though. Maybe I'll change my mind in the morning, but I don't think I'll be satisfied until I get some answers. So I decided to go. I realized that the more time I spent thinking about it, the closer I'd get to talking myself out of it, and that couldn't happen. Somehow this felt important that I figure it out. I drove over to the neighborhood and parked on the street opposite the house in the exact same spot I had as last time. It didn't take long for the unease to set in. I tried not to look over at it. Even though the burnt house was always there, creeping into the corner of my vision. Thankfully the street wasn't as empty as last time. There were a few cars parked in some driveways and even a couple of kids kicking a ball around on one of the lawns. It took a while for me to settle my nerves, to make a firm commitment to stay there and wait. I'd gotten out there an hour early. I suppose it was a way of giving myself an out, a chance to bail at the very last moment. A few minutes later, I got a call from my sister asking if I'd been able to drive her somewhere later that week. I agree and almost in passing mentioned that I'm about to meet up with Dad, as if that could possibly be something that she'd gone on and ignored. As far as I was concerned, she didn't talk to him either. The moment I tell her this, the line goes silent and I begin to think that she's hung up on me. But then I look at the screen and the call is still going.
Hello?
I ask.
Sarah, are you there?
What do you mean Dad's coming to meet you? She asked. I sighed. Look, it's a long story. I called him up yesterday and we decided to meet up. He said he's living close by and that he'll make the drive over. Close by? She interrupted, sounding confused. What are you talking about? Dad moved to Australia. He's been there for years. Now I was the one that rendered silent. What? How do you know that? I asked. She goes on to tell me how she started talking to him again a few years back. A way to reconcile things after the incident. I really didn't like the way she'd said it. What? I shook my head. What incident? She goes into another bout of silence and after a while says, "The house, the fire, you really don't remember?" I told her no, I don't, and all of a sudden I start to feel really dizzy. I check the time and it's 20 minutes before my dad is supposed to show up, and I feel a pit growing in my stomach. I start to look around and I end up focusing in on the two kids playing in the yard. At first I wasn't sure why it was so unsettling, but after a while I realized that it was in their movements. Too emotionless, too mechanical, almost like they were trying to pretend to be natural. They were literally just standing in place, kicking the ball in a straight line back and forth, no talking, no laughing, just blank stares. I suppose the sight of them had put me into a trance or something because I looked back at the clock and it was 3:01 p.m. I checked my phone. The line had been cut and it looked like Sarah had tried calling me back a few times afterwards. My heart began to beat really fast and I looked around but there was nobody else that had arrived. I took this as a blessing and started my car and prepared to get the fuck out of Dodge when I caught movement coming from the corner of my eye. Someone had opened up the front door of the house from the inside. For a moment I sat stunned. I didn't want to look. I knew that I shouldn't, but of course I couldn't stop myself. Standing in the darkness of the doorway was something tall, something pale and naked. It had skinny limbs and box-like torso, but its head was too high up to see, blocked out by the doorframe. It stood there for a long time while I tried to find it in me to move. You need to leave. I kept repeating that in my head. You need to get the fuck away. Yet I couldn't. I was basically paralyzed in place. Eventually the person, or whatever it was, moved. It hunched its head while its shoulders stayed in place, and the moment I saw that its hanging, grinning jaw, the mouth filled with long black teeth, I snapped out of it and put my car into drive and sped away. After getting home later that day, I considered my options. Of course I couldn't just do nothing, forget it all. Never go back to the house, or hell, even that town. never bring it up to anybody, just cut all ties with the situation as a whole. But somehow that felt like the wrong move. Just a subtle inkling that if I were to try and ignore it, things would become worse. That's something that would go out of its way to pursue me. I needed to deal with it, but in order to do that, I first needed to understand what the hell it was. I've always had this suspicion that there were certain things that my mind had been repressing all these years, and that a call with my sister had all but confirmed it. It made sense, the lapses in my memory, the estranged relationship with my dad. I never bothered thinking about it before because life had served as good enough distraction. Maybe that's exactly what I'd wanted, what I'd been hoping for. But now it's obvious that the past wasn't willing to let me go. I called my sister again and asked for Dad's number, his real number. As soon as he picked up the phone, I noticed the differences in his voice compared to whoever the hell I'd been talking to earlier. But the fucked up part was that they still sounded somewhat similar, as if the fake had made a concerted effort to study and emulate not only my dad's voice but his way of speaking, and he'd almost nailed it. If I hadn't been able to compare to the real thing within a short amount of time, probably wouldn't have even registered. We started off by exchanging awkward pleasantries, but I was eager to get to the bottom of things, to find out the truth behind this incident. I'm sure I had forced myself to push it away for good reason, but once again, this had become something that needed to be dealt with. Once I brought it up, my dad went silent. After a while, just shied. "You really don't remember?" I assured him that no, I did not. After hesitating for a few moments, he went ahead and laid it all out based on what he knew himself and what he had been told by the police after the fact. It happened when I was 14, 1 year before starting high school. Dad was working late at his office, so I'd been home alone at the time. Sarah was out on a week-long school camping trip or something. Just as he's getting ready to leave, he gets a phone call from the police. The house across from ours had burned down, and when the firefighters had gone in to rescue anybody trapped inside, they had found me. And can you guess where? In the basement, completely passed out and minutes away from being fully engulfed in the flames. There was nobody else in the house, just me. Of course, Dad rushed straight to the hospital, and when I came around several hours later, both him and the police were grilling me, asking why I'd gone into the house to begin with. According to him, my responses had been mostly incoherent, but from what little they could decipher, I'd gone in because I needed to get to the portal in the basement. As soon as he said this, my blood ran cold. I listened on. Apparently the cops were suspicious of me, suspect number one, even though there was little supporting evidence of my involvement besides the fact that I was the only one in the house. Eventually they dropped it, boiled it down to some freaking accident. The young couple that owned the house were never found, and when they asked my dad and the other neighbors where they might be, nobody had a clue. In fact, once they thought about it, they realized that none of them had exchanged more than a few words with these people in any given interaction, and nobody knew what they did for a living. A few of them had even said that they'd only ever seen them leave their house late at night and return early the next morning. The next thing he told me was part that really freaked me out. While I was still in the hospital, the firefighter that had first found me approached my dad and said that he knew for a fact that I couldn't have been the one that burned the place down. My dad asked him how he could be so sure, and this is what the guy told him. When he'd seen me in the basement, I wasn't actually alone. I'd been passed out, and that part was true, but standing at the end of the room were other people, maybe a dozen of them, all clustered together in a tight crowd, but they weren't right. They were too tall, too pale, their faces too long, their grinning mouths too wide. The most upsetting part was that they were all naked and standing perfectly still within the roaring flames. For a moment, Jake thought that they might have been lifelike statues, and he hoped they were. He called out to them, "Are you all right?" They didn't respond or move at all, so he felt safe enough to walk forward and grab me. But the moment he did, he could see all of their expressions change in unison. The smiles suddenly replaced by looks of sheer malice. He said it was the first and only time he'd ever seen pure evil in front of him. My dad explained. It was in their eyes, a complete lack of soul. Jake then lifted me up and started to carry me away as the smoke began to get suffocating. He thought he saw one of them step forward, and that's when he lost his shit and bolted. I'm not sure I believe it, my dad continued, but I don't know what he'd gained from lying. I really don't. He went on to explain how for the next few days following the incident, I had been borderline catatonic, wouldn't speak, would barely eat, and the only person that Jake had told the story to was my dad. Even throughout the entire ordeal, he kept it to himself, because who would believe it? Right before they began to seriously consider seeking out professional help, I snapped out of it, just like that. No memory of the incident, but strangely enough, I had asked to be sent to live with my uncle all the way over in a different town. I didn't tell anybody why, but I just seemed dead set on it. I never talked to my dad after that, but in all fairness, he hadn't tried reaching out to me either. I wasn't sure what to say or think, so I told him goodbye and hung up. Tall, pale, long, hanging grins. The people in the basement remember you. The more I thought about it, the more I could begin to remember it. The voice luring me in, the stinging heat of the fire, the faces, the strange dancing, the chants, that purple void in the corner. I shook my head. Fuck this, I thought. Whatever the hell this was, I wasn't about to be dragged back into it. I called the police and made an anonymous tip. I told them that I had good reason to suspect that there were a group of people running a meth lab in the basement of a burnt down house a few towns over. I told them that I had good reason to believe that they were armed and violent, to send more than a few cars, maybe even the SWAT. Then I gave them the address. And that marked the last of my involvement with this mess. I won't let them drag me back into it. I won't bite, no matter what they do. I won't look at the children playing out in the field below my balcony, the children that were never there before. I won't answer the calls from the unknown numbers. I won't open the fortune cookies that keep coming for me in the mail. I won't let them win. I never wanted to be a police officer, at least not in the way that some of my colleagues did when they droned on about how they always wanted to be on the police force, even as little kids. Now they were always dressed in their precious little policeman costumes every Halloween and did push-ups in their room at night and went on ride-alongs after they graduated high school. All I actually heard was they were colossal kiss asses that relished even an iota of authority over others, either real or imagined. Don't get me wrong, I did actually want to be a police officer, and I did feel like I was doing something important. I think that's what made me get out of bed in the morning, but it was also just a job with a decent salary and a good pension, not some sort of phony higher calling. And I knew that I would have to put up with some bullshit, especially at the beginning. The washout rate of new hires was roughly 50%, so I fully braced myself for all the shit that was expected to come my way. Sorry, I'm probably being a little melodramatic. I might be a little jaded after everything I've seen in the past 25 years with the state police. In 1994, I finished the Louisiana State Police Academy and was given my first posting, a patrol assignment during the graveyard shift of 11 p.m. to 8 a.m. Not uncommon for a rookie assignment. My patrol zone was called Le Bateau, which was actually 3 adjoining Bayou parishes all situated along the southwest corner of the coast. Le Bateau had a few working class towns along the one highway that connected them all, but was ultimately a poor and neglected part of the state. Between the small port towns, Le Bateau was almost mostly empty. No movie theaters, no sit-down restaurants, and definitely no available women. I wondered why anyone even bothered to live here, as there were surely better opportunities back towards New Orleans. Admittedly, everything about these bayous that I was assigned to put me on edge. There was just something I couldn't put my finger on. Maybe it was just the general atmosphere of the place. There were long, unpaved roads, the dim light of the oil tankers in the distance, the old weathered stone forts, covered by vines and nearly forgotten by time. I got a cold chill down my spine every time I heard the Gulf wind softly whistling through the trees. I think the worst part of the Le Bateau was that you never got the feeling that you were alone. When I would drive between the little towns, the trees seemingly enclosing me, it always felt like there was some dreadful presence out there, barely hidden from view, just waiting, watching. It would have been nice to have a partner to distract me, or even know that there would be backup if it was needed, but the state was not known for their fiscal abilities, especially not in those days. I guess I should have just been grateful for a patrol car and field to put it in. I did have a little company occasionally. A radio dispatch officer was stationed about 50 miles away, handled 911 calls for my section of the state, sending myself and other officers out to wherever we needed in our respective patrol zones. Other than that though, I had little human contact during my shifts. I was called to break up the occasional bar fight or help someone jump their car's battery down at the steel mill, the area's largest employer. Most of my nights I spent cruising on the winding dirt roads along the coast, assuming the local fishermen may have some petty grievances that I would need to sort out. But I always did my job like I was supposed to. I didn't slack off or shirk my responsibilities just because I didn't like my bosses, the bateau, or the fucking bayou. I showed up on time, responded to the calls, and wrote my reports. All by the books. And if the place made the hair on my back stand up, it didn't matter. I would get a promotion after a year or so and move on to better assignments. All I had to do was swallow my discomfort and pay my dues. One night I was sitting in my patrol car just trying to finish an incident report. I parked off the side of the little dirt road that ran parallel to the coast and connected two small towns. I'd picked this place to stop because it was right in front of an old church that I was convinced was abandoned, even if the sign out front was updated every Sunday. It was the only place on this road that wasn't surrounded by trees on either side, and I did not enjoy feeling claustrophobic out here in the dark. The rain was pouring so loudly outside that I could no longer hear the chitter of insects outside. I looked down at my report, which I was struggling with. An old man had called the police to report his daughter was missing, only for me to find out that the old man didn't remember her name, what year it was, or the fact that the daughter had moved out 20 years ago. I don't even know why I bothered. Absolutely no one was ever going to read this. As I watched rain droplets race down my windshield, I pulled a cigarette out and lit it up. The clock on my radio said 1:47 in the morning. I allowed myself to take pity on myself for a minute. Surely I wasn't going to get promoted for my thorough reports on poor old men with dementia. I rolled down my window enough to flick my cigarette butt out into the road and put it up quickly to keep the rain out. As I was about to take up my incident report again, the police radio lit up, illuminating my patrol car with its soft amber lights as it let out a series of crackles. I grabbed the handheld responder, waiting to hear from dispatch. The radio crackled again, this time followed by static. After waiting 10 or so seconds, I finally mashed the button on my responder, worried I was missing something important from the head office.
Dispatch, this is Patrol 57. I missed your last message. Please repeat. Over.
After a few seconds, the radio lit up again.
Patrol 57, this is Dispatch. No message for you at this time. Over.
I put my responder down and studied my radio for a second. Maybe it was just some local interference from an AM tower or a trucker and a shortwave radio passing me by on the highway about 15 miles north. The radio lit up again, this time going directly to static. I focused intently, trying to make out any words I might hear. The static continued, but a background whine was present as well. Its pitch went higher and lower, almost rhythmically, it seemed. I moved my head closer to the radio, listening as closely as I could. I swear that I heard a voice through the static, spoken as a whisper.
"Help me."
And then all the noise from the radio stopped, leaving me in the darkness. As I reached up to turn on the overhead light, I could feel my mind churning at 1,000,000 miles per hour. I took in a big gulp of air and let it out slowly, then grabbed the radio's responder.
"Dispatch, Patrol 57 again. Please confirm again that no message has been sent. Over."
The radio jumped back to life once more.
"Patrol 57 confirming no messages. Likely just interference. Please keep this channel clear, officer. Over."
I could tell that there was an air of annoyance in the dispatcher's voice. I might have been a little irritated as well if I were in their shoes. I sighed and put on the radio's responder back on its hook. I sat for a minute in the darkness, wondering what I should do next. On one hand, I knew that dispatch was probably right about the message just being interference. Also, I might not even heard anyone speaking. Could have been just my brain trying to find something human in the overwhelming static. Almost like how you always seem to find faces and bodies in random patterns. On the other hand, I knew that I should investigate, just in case someone actually did need help. I shuddered at what horrid situation someone must be in if they're whispering for help on a shortwave radio at 2 a.m. There was only one place they could be: the church. When I stepped out of my patrol car onto the dirt road, I was soaked within seconds. I pulled my hat down tightly over my forehead, trying to keep the rain out of my eyes. Then I grabbed the heavy flashlight off of my belt and twisted it on, throwing light on the wooden sign in front of the small, ramshackle church. Underneath the church's name was a Bible quote: "Rejoice, for he is always present." Unsurprisingly, it wasn't nearly as reassuring as one would hope as I stood in the rain, preparing myself to walk up to the church. There was a narrow drive that led up to the side of the property of the church. It must have been only 60 or 70 feet, but in that moment it might as well have been a mile. To the left of the drive was the church's front lawn, the grass tall and overgrown with weeds. To the right, however, was the edge of the bayou forest. The trees and brush were so thick that you could never see more than a few feet in, even in daytime. I don't know what worried me more, the impenetrable jungle or the decrepit church. I slowly walked up the small drive, the mud squelching beneath my feet. I kept my light pointed into the trees lining the right-hand side of the drive, occasionally looking over my shoulder in case the rain drowned out the sound of something behind me. As I looked forward again, something in the trees caught my eyes. When I turned and pointed my flashlight into the brush, the shining pair of eyes were staring back at me. I didn't even get a good look before the eyes disappeared in a flurry of movement, concealed by a thick underbrush. I stood and stared into the jungle for a moment before I realized I was holding my breath. I forced myself to slowly exhale and try to breathe regularly. Shouldn't be this tense. I was a police officer, goddammit. What are you gonna do next time? Shoot at a raccoon in someone's garbage? Fucking coward. I kicked myself mentally, then forced myself to quickly power myself up the remainder of the drive and onto the steps of the church. I reached the landing in front of the church doors and knocked. "Police," I yelled. "Is anyone here?" I held my ear to the door but didn't hear any movement. I waited 30 seconds and knocked again. Nothing. I stepped over to the corner of the landing to a small window and peered in. I had to cup my eyes around my face to block out the glare of the moonlight. I could see a relatively small room filled with a dozen or so wooden pews and an altar at the back. Behind the altar was an impressively large crucifix with the ceramic figure of Jesus attached to it. Even with almost no light, I could see the pained expression on his face. Enough of this, I thought. If there's someone here, they've had ample warning. I grabbed the doorknob and gave it a try. Surprisingly, it turned. The door was unlocked. I gave the door a slight push and stepped back as it swung open with a soft groan. I pointed the flashlight into the meager room, dutifully examining every corner before I entered. I took a few steps in and yelled again, "Police, is there anyone here?" When no one answered, I went down the aisle between the 2 rows of pews. I could see a thin layer of dust on each of the wooden benches. I got the impression that this church hasn't had any congregants in a while. As I walked, it felt like ceramic figures' eyes were following me, no matter where I stepped. Even when I looked down at each pew, I could feel the eyes on the side of my head, and I would quickly turn to face the altar. I found a doorway to my left when I finally made it up the altar. The door was open and I pointed my light into the dark room. There was a small kitchen with old appliances lining the far wall, a sink on one end, and a round wooden table with 4 chairs. I found a light switch on the wall when I walked into the kitchen. The room began to softly hum as the fluorescent lights above the kitchen table came on. Not sure why I didn't look for a switch in the main room when I first entered the church. Maybe the building looked so old to me that I just assumed it didn't have electricity. That's ridiculous, I thought. Even the poorest areas of Le Bateau at least have electricity and running water, regardless of how low my opinion of it was. Standing in the entrance to the kitchen, there was one door to my right, along with the window next to it overlooking what I assumed was the backside of the church building. When I stepped over to the window and peered out, I shuddered. It was the church's cemetery, filled with tall granite headstones, most of them covered with black mildew from decades of rain and neglect. Behind the headstones was a forest of reeds. I realized that it must have been a marsh or some sort of tidal area. These weren't uncommon on the coast. Obviously, I imagined all of the local wildlife hiding just a few steps into the marsh, waiting for their next meal. In the other corner of the room towards the front of the church was yet another door. If there was anyone here, this was the only other place they could be. Having a bit more courage with the light on, I marched towards the door and quickly flung it open. The brightness of the kitchen contrasted with the darkness of this new room, made me stop for a few seconds and let my eyes readjust. When I could finally see clearly again, I found myself looking into a bedroom that appeared to be mostly empty. I saw a small television in front of me sitting on top of a weathered gray carpet. In the corner was a short wooden dresser with what appeared to be an old radio on top. Then I noticed the twin bed in the far corner. I stopped still. There was someone in the bed. I could see what I assumed was the back of an old man's head based on the short white hair. In the narrow corridor of light coming from the kitchen, I tiptoed towards the bed. It felt like an eternity to cover the few steps of the old man, but when I finally made it, I gently laid my hand on his shoulder. I didn't even try to shake the old man awake. He was so stiff and so cold that even I, inexperienced as I was, knew he was dead. Radio dispatch told me it would be several hours before a coroner would arrive to pronounce the old priest dead and fill out the old relevant paperwork. Until then, I was to stay put and keep the area secure. Fortunately, no one was around to see me roll my eyes at this command. I decided to sit at the church's small kitchen table to do my paperwork, with the bedroom's door firmly shut. I didn't like my directions to secure the scene, whatever that meant, but I didn't feel like waiting in my patrol car was technically what I was supposed to be doing. It was probably safer to hang out inside and keep an eye on things. After the whispered message on the radio, I oddly felt safer in the outdated kitchen than I did outside in my dimly lit squad car in the middle of nowhere. But this did raise an important question to me. Was the message that I heard real? I mean, it did lead me to find the old man. Or was it simply a coincidence? Most priests that I encountered here in the Bayous were fairly old, so this scenario didn't seem particularly unlikely. But if it was real, how did it get sent? Did the priest contact me from beyond the grave? Why would he need help? Unfortunately, I didn't have time to dwell on it. I could hear a soft buzz coming from the bedroom. I sat in silence for a moment, unsure of what was happening. Hesitantly, I stood up and went over to the bedroom door as the buzzing grew louder. I slowly turned the knob and pushed the door open, keeping one hand on the wall inside the kitchen. Then I knew exactly what the noise was. Atop the wooden dresser in the corner, the radio was on and emitting the same static that I heard in my patrol car earlier. I don't know if I stayed in the doorway because I was so terrified that my legs refused to work or because I was simply dumbfounded. Either way, I stood in place, transfixed on the radio. The radio did the same pattern as before, static with the background whine whose frequency went higher and lower in a uniform pattern. But then, abruptly, all noise stopped.
Help me.
A voice screamed at me from the radio. My heart sank. This time there was no mistaking the message from my imagination, and even worse, the voice was not that of an old man, but instead of a child, a boy. I don't know what I expected to happen, but for some reason in the panic of the moment, I decided to yell out, "Where are you? Are you in trouble?" I stood, still frozen in the doorway, holding my breath and waiting for the radio to give me an answer. Instead, the radio let out a gentle humming noise. As I stood and listened, the hum gradually got louder and louder, switching from a hum to a whine. Before I knew it, a high-pitched squeal was filling the church and rattling every bone inside my head, making me feel like my brain was in a vice. As a final act, the radio sent out a shower of sparks from its corner of the room, briefly illuminating it like the flash of a lightning strike. I jumped, squeezing my eyes shut and clenching my fists. The noise had to come from behind me, near the back door to the cemetery. When I turned around, nothing seemed out of place, but the noise had clearly come from outside. I peeked back into the bedroom. The priest was still there. A scorched radio sat in its place on top of the dresser. I decided that the poor old man wouldn't go anywhere and nervously grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen table. As I moved towards the back door, I realized where the noise had come from. On the window was a handprint. It was small, the size of a child's hand. But I had looked out of this window earlier and didn't notice any handprint. It had to be new. When I got to the window, I could see that the handprint was a dirty brown color, almost like whomever's hand that was made this print had been covered in mud. I felt the hot, moist air hit me as I opened the back door. It had finally quit raining, allowing me to step outside without being drenched. I shined my flashlight down the worn concrete steps and into the cemetery. The headstones certainly didn't look any less ominous than they did from the window earlier. As I stepped down the steps and into the cemetery, I looked at one of the headstones. Michelle Levesque had died and been buried here in 1849. How old was this place? There must have been 50 or so headstones in this cemetery, all in similar states of despair. Most of them were standing off-kilter and nearly black from the decades of Louisiana weather. Keeping this place maintained must not have been part of the deceased's duties. I moved deliberately through the small graveyard, pointing my light behind each of the headstones as I went past. If the priest had been alive, he probably could have heard my heart pound from inside his bedroom. I kept moving until I reached the last row of graves. I stopped. On the back of the headstone nearest to me was another small, muddy handprint. Swoosh. It was the sound of reeds brushing together. I twisted my head over towards the marsh, just a dozen steps or so behind the cemetery. Standing directly in front of head-high reeds was a boy who couldn't have been older than 8 or 9 years old. I don't know why this sticks out of my memory, but I distinctly remember that he was wearing a scout's uniform. Dark blue with classic shorts and high socks, badges littering his chest. Then I saw his face. His eyes were completely black. They were so intensely dark that he may not even had eyes for all I know. This was a distinct contrast to his face, which was a sickly shade of white bordering on translucent. On his face there was an unmistakable expression of sadness. The boy's expression soured as he tilted his head. He opened his mouth and I fully expected to hear a foul, ear-piercing scream. Instead, what came out was barely a whisper.
"Why won't you help me?"
The boy murmured woefully. Then in a swift motion, he turned and began walking along the edge of the marsh. I stood in stunned silence for what felt like hours, watching the boy move away from me. I realized that I had to act. Somehow I convinced my legs to overcome whatever fear or inertia was holding me in place and followed after the child, or ghost, or whatever had just stood in front of me. I followed behind the boy alongside the thicket of reeds that outlined the marsh. He was moving much faster than I expected, and I had to pick up my pace to keep him in my sights. We left the boundary of the church's backyard and into the thick bayou brush. I kept my eyes on the boy as soon as I dodged vines and fallen trees. He always seemed to be a fair distance ahead of me. Only when I had reached a small clearing did I lose the boy entirely. I spun around, swinging my flashlight wildly. Somehow I had managed to keep a hold of it in the scramble through the woods. There was nothing. Somehow I had lost the boy and found myself standing in ankle-high mud. I strained my eyes as I looked around, desperate to find a sign of where he might have gone. Why would he bring me out here? Was it to kill me? Was this some kind of trap? My heart suddenly picked up its pace. I was desperate to get out of this swamp as quickly as I could. I told myself that as soon as I got back to the church, I would jump in my patrol car and get out of this nightmare. Dead priest be damned. The coroner could figure it out all in daylight.
"Help me."
The whisper behind me threw my heart into a frenzy and I panicked, attempting to turn and back away at the same time, only to fall on my back into the sticky mud that I had been standing in. The boy was now a few feet away, still with the look of despair on his face. Unexpectedly, he turned himself to the side and pointed towards the marsh beside him. "Help me," he whispered again. I finally knew why I had been brought here. Slowly, I stood myself up, trying to remove the mud off my hand and arms. I stood still for a moment, watching the little boy. He stood firmly like a statue, still pointing into the marsh. I gave him a wide berth as I crept around him, making sure to never face away. When I got a few feet away, I let myself look at where he was pointing, trying to keep him in my field of vision. I searched around in the mud for a moment, unsure of what I was looking for, and then I saw it. A small, circular object stuck partway out of the marsh. I stared at it for a second. My thoughts scrambled, but when I picked it up, I knew exactly what it was. A merit badge. "Is this?" I started to ask as I turned back to the boy, but the boy was gone. Somehow in the half second I had turned away from him, he had vanished. I turned back to where I had found the merit badge and dropped to my knees, halfway sinking into the muck. And then I started to dig, frantically scooping mud away with my hands. I dug with an urgency that I didn't even know existed in me. I found myself breathing heavily, realizing that the waterlogged muck was much heavier than I expected, but I knew that I couldn't stop, not until I found the boy. I finally cleared all of the mud off the boy's body sometime after sunrise. I had thought about bringing him back up to the church as it seemed like a decent thing to do, but realized that he would have to be photographed and documented by the coroner and crime scene group. I was busy chain smoking the rest of my cigarettes on the front steps of the church when the coroner finally arrived. Seeing me covered in mud and nervously tapping my foot, the coroner sent me home to shower and take a nap before I was to come up to the dispatch office and give my statement to another officer. I gave my statement to the best of my memory, radio, ghost, and all. I knew that they would say that I was either crazy or lying, and I worried that I may end up in even a worse patrol or potentially fired. but there was no other reasonable explanation for how I found the boy's body. When the statement was typed up and handed me to sign, I realized that almost everything about the radio and the boy had been left out. I signed it. No one ever brought it up again. I certainly didn't. Not until now. They solved the boy's case pretty quickly. He had been missing since 1981, and the original investigator had always suspected the boy's father, but had never been able to make a case without a body. Apparently the marsh, with its thick mud squeezing out any oxygen, had preserved the boy's body so well that there was enough remaining trace evidence to finally convict the father. I think he's still on death row, appeal pending. As for the priest, the coroner determined that he died of natural causes. A heart attack, miles away from any sort of help. The archdiocese had assigned a new priest to the old church within a few days. A fairly young guy too. I felt sorry for him considering everything that happened there. If it were up to me, I would have had the place torn down. I still don't know why the boy picked me. Why he didn't reach out to the priest still doesn't make sense to me. Maybe he did for all I know. But I remember that I didn't sleep normally for a week after that horrible night at the church. Every time I turned a corner, my heart raced, expecting him to be standing there. The memory of his desperate face and pointing towards his marshy grave etched into my memory. I visit the marsh every year. Sometimes I bring flowers and place them at the edge of the marsh. I know that the boy isn't physically there anymore, and I hope that whatever part of him that remained and led me to his body has finally left. Maybe that's why I visit, just to reassure myself that he's not still there. I always make sure to bring along a radio.